In this talk on innate immunity, we're going to learn about the barriers involved in host defenses. We will concentrate on learning about the different routes of entry that pathogens employ to infect the host, as well as the numerous barriers that are present in the host that protects it from infection. The first step in the infection process is the ability of the pathogen to gain entry into the host. Now, pathogens can enter the host through many different ways. Let us look at some of them. One way is the skin. The skin is the largest organ of the body, and hence it is easy for the pathogen to invade into the host through the skin. Eyes and ears are also a good way for pathogens to enter the host. The nose leads to the respiratory tract, and that is another way pathogens can gain entry. Similarly, they can gain entry through the mouth, which is part of the gastrointestinal tract. We then have the urogenital tract, which also has access to the external environment and thus is a good entry point for pathogens. Finally, we have our normal flora. Our normal flora is the microbiome of our body. It comprises of many different microorganisms that include bacteria, viruses, fungi, so on and so forth. Now, viruses are obligate intracellular pathogens, but in the case of bacteria and fungi, a lot of times they coexist with us and provide us with benefits. In such situations, when these normal flora organisms become pathogens, it's usually because there is some sort of a change in the environment that they are in. And such organisms are opportunists. Now, the host has evolved many different ways to prevent entry of pathogens. And one of these ways is by having anatomical barriers. So let us look at some of these barriers. There are different barriers that are present in the host to prevent the entry of microorganisms. Some of these can be in the form of a mechanical barrier that blocks the entry of the microorganisms, while others are in the form of chemicals that are able to kill or inhibit the growth of microorganisms. Some of the barriers that we are going to look at in this talk include many different kinds of barriers, and they're all listed here. So we're going to begin by looking at the skin. The skin is the largest organ of our body, and it is made up of an outer epidermis and an inner dermis. The cells of the epidermis are dead or dying, and they express an intermediate filament called keratin. These dead or dying cells, along with the keratin, they form quite a rigid layer that does not allow microorganisms to penetrate through this epidermis. The epidermis also forms a semi-watertight barrier, and thus it does not allow pathogens to invade into the host. However, there are situations where microorganisms can penetrate through the skin, and this usually happens when there is a breach in the epidermis. This breach can occur when the skin is cut or it is bruised. When it's very dry outside and your skin is not moisturized, your skin can also crack, and microorganisms can breach through the skin and invade into the host through this cracked skin. Sometimes you can have a breach in the epidermis due to insect bites, which makes the skin more susceptible to infections. Finally, it should be remembered that when the skin is burned, usually we have a lot of damage to the epidermis, and this makes the dermis exposed. The dermis is not as rigid as the epidermis is, and thus when there is a burnt portion in the skin, microorganisms are able to infect the skin and invade the host more readily. That is why burn victims are very susceptible to infections. Our body makes an oily secretion called sebum that usually covers the skin. Sebum is made by the sebaceous glands that are shown in that blue box in the figure. The sebaceous glands are almost always present near hair follicles. The sebaceous glands make the sebum, which contains unsaturated fatty acids that are able to inhibit bacterial and fungal growth on the skin. The organic acids that are made by sebum lower the pH of the skin too. In addition to sebaceous glands, we also have sweat glands. The sweat glands, which are shown in the blue box of the figure, produce sweat. Now, sweat is a secretion that helps eliminate waste from the body, and it also helps regulate body temperature. Now, sweat is not oily. On the other hand, it's more aqueous and is salty. It is acidic and has the enzyme called lysozyme, and all of these together prevent microbial growth. Tears are another barrier that are produced by our body, and they're produced by the lacrimal glands that are present near the eyes. These lacrimal glands will produce tears that constantly flush the eyes. The tears are then drained into the lacrimal canal and then finally into the nasal cavity. This constant drainage of tears is very important because if there is a problem with drainage, then they will accumulate in the eyes and the eyes become more prone to eye infections. Now, tears are able to protect our eyes from pathogens because they contain different molecules like antibodies. Now, antibodies are able to prevent microbes from attaching to the different eye tissues, and they also help in neutralizing any toxins that are made by the microorganisms. Tears also contain lysozyme, which is an enzyme that can break down peptidoglycan, which is a major component of the cell wall of some bacteria. Additionally, lipocalin that is present in tears is able to bind to iron, which is very essential for the growth of microorganisms. Thus, all these molecules in the tears are able to protect our eyes from microorganisms that are there in the environment. The epithelia also form a barrier, and they're basically the cells that are present on body surfaces. These include the cells that line the respiratory tract or the gastrointestinal tract. The main types of epithelia are squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. When we look at these different types of epithelia, we can have the simple squamous epithelium. And in this case, we have one sheet of cells, but they are irregularly shaped. In the case of the simple cuboidal epithelium, we do have one sheet of cells, but when we look at their shape, the cells are more cube-like. In the case of simple columnar epithelial cells, we again have one sheet of cells, but when we look at their shape, they're more elongated and hence look like a column. On the other hand, we can have stratified squamous, where we have multiple layers of squamous epithelial cells. Similarly, stratified cuboid will have multiple layers of the cuboidal epithelial cells, and the pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells have the appearance that they are different layers of columnar epithelial cells. We can have a combination of squamous, cuboidal, or columnar cells, and in that situation we have the transitional epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are held together by multi-protein complexes between the cells that are called as tight junctions. Now, tight junctions prevent leakage, and here when we look at the figure, we can see a few epithelial cells, and the tight junctions are shown in the blue boxes between the two cells. They're usually made up of proteins like claudins and occludins, and they're able to form a very strong structure that prevents leakage. And thus, any microorganisms are unable to penetrate between the cells due to the presence of these tight junctions. However, if there is a breakdown of that tight junction, then now microorganisms are able to enter into the host through the space between the two cells. And that is why tight junctions are very important. Now, epithelial surfaces can be associated with commensal bacteria, and these commensal bacteria form the microbiota of that region. So that's why it's even more important to have tight junctions, because that way these microbiota or commensal bacteria that are present on the epithelial surfaces are unable to penetrate through the epithelial cells into the inner parts of the host. Mucous membranes help protect different parts of the body that contact the outside environment. So what parts of our body contact the outside environment? And when we think about that, these include the respiratory tract, the digestive tract, and even the urogenital tract. In all these instances, the linings are in contact with the external environment and hence are susceptible to different microorganisms. Now, the mucus that is made over the cells that form these linings are made by specialized cells called goblet cells. These goblet cells make the mucus, and the mucus is then secreted out and it covers the epithelial surfaces. This mucus that covers the epithelial surfaces is sticky, and hence it's able to trap the different microorganisms. And by trapping the microorganisms, it's preventing them from interacting with the underlying epithelial cells, and thus it is harder for the microorganisms to breach through the epithelial lining. Another fun fact is that the mucus that is produced also protects the stomach wall of the gastrointestinal tract from the acids produced by the stomach. So many times when people have ulcers, then usually there is a problem with the mucus production, and because of that, the stomach lining or the epithelial cells that form the stomach wall come in contact with the acid and are damaged that way. Thus, mucus plays an important role. So while the mucus in the mucous membranes helps trap bacteria due to the sticky nature of the mucus, a lot of times the underlying epithelial cells have these hair-like appendages called cilia that move. The movement of these cilia allow the outward flow of mucus to help clear these linings of microorganisms. So let us look at the respiratory system, where we have these epithelial ciliated cells that rhythmically move, and that results in the upward movement of the mucus. The mucus ultimately will move towards the larynx and the esophagus, and this whole system is called as the mucociliary escalator. So here we can see the mucociliary escalator in action, where we can see a bacteria being pushed upwards due to the beating of the cilia. And so this bacteria stuck in the mucus goes to the esophagus, where we will then swallow it, and it will go into the gastrointestinal tract, where it will be most likely destroyed in the stomach. Thus, the mucociliary escalator plays a really important role in removing microorganisms from the respiratory system. Saliva plays a really important role in defending the body from organisms that enter through the mouth. Now, saliva is produced by salivary glands that are present in the mouth, and they aid in cleansing the teeth as well as the mucous membranes that are present in the mouth. Saliva also helps in washing bacteria so that they can move from the mouth to the stomach. Saliva has different molecules like enzymes that prepare the food for digestion. So we do have enzymes like amylase that can start breaking down the starches that are there in our food and help in digestion that way. Saliva also has antibodies that prevent the microbes from attaching to the different epithelial surfaces. Saliva also has lysozyme that digests peptidoglycan, and they also make these antimicrobial peptide called histatin that is known to show antifungal activity. Thus, all these molecules present in the saliva help in getting rid of microorganisms that enter our body through the mouth. Our body makes different fluids and secretions that also aid in host defense, which includes gastric juice, urine, and vaginal secretions. The gastric juice that is made in the stomach is comprised of stomach enzymes and acids. The stomach enzymes help in the breakdown of ingested food, while the acids create a low pH environment that prevents microbial growth. Urine is produced by the urinary tract, and it has acidic compounds that prevents microbial attachment and growth, thereby protecting the urinary tract. In the case of females, the vagina is a region that is very exposed to the outside environment and hence is a good place for microorganisms to enter into the host. So vaginal secretions that are produced help keep the local environment acidic. Additionally, as part of the normal microbiome, we do have bacteria that make lactic acid that also help in keeping the local environment acidic and limiting bacterial growth. Vaginal secretions also help in flushing organisms, thereby keeping a lower microbial load. Another way our body protects us is through the production of antimicrobial molecules. Antimicrobial molecules can be made by specialized epithelial cells, but they can also be made by other types of cells. These antimicrobial molecules are able to limit pathogen growth and colonization. In this picture, we're looking at the different antimicrobial molecules like defensins and Reg3 that are made by the epithelial cells of the intestine. The epiglottis plays an important role in host defense by preventing food or water or even saliva from entering the respiratory tract. When we look at the figure, the epiglottis can be seen as this flap of tissue that is present at the back of the throat. Now, when we're not swallowing and we're just inhaling air, the epiglottis is positioned in such a way that the air is able to enter into the respiratory tract. However, when we are swallowing, and we could be swallowing food or water or even saliva, then the epiglottis positions itself in such a way that it actually closes the respiratory tract, and thereby it allows that food or water or saliva to enter the esophagus, which is part of the gastrointestinal tract. Once that swallowing motion is complete, then it opens up the respiratory tract again, and thereby air can now enter the respiratory tract. So this way, the epiglottis prevents food or water or saliva from entering the respiratory tract. It's important that food or water or saliva not enter because a lot of times they will have microorganisms, and this way we're keeping the microorganisms away from the respiratory tract. One thing we should remember is that there are instances where accidentally food, water, or saliva can enter the respiratory tract. And when that happens, our body has this immediate reflex of coughing that food or fluid out of the respiratory tract. Peristalsis also plays an important role in host defense. Peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction and relaxation of muscles that helps in the movement of things like food. This constant movement of, for example, food is important because any microorganisms that are associated with it are also moving constantly. And this prevents the colonization of the microbes on the epithelial surfaces. So while our body has designed many different mechanisms to ward off pathogens, it is interesting to note that we get help from other microorganisms too. So we all have our own normal microbiome, and these resident microbiota help in warding off pathogens. They're able to do that in many different ways, which include competing with pathogens for nutrients, as well as making certain substances that can be antimicrobial in nature. They also can make toxins that are detrimental to different pathogens, and they're able to compete with pathogens for space. Thus, our normal microbiome also plays a really important role in host defense. With this, we come to the end of this talk where we learned about the different routes of entry of pathogens as well as the numerous barriers that are present in the host that include this entire list. And all these barriers help in protecting the host from pathogens.